My hands trembled as I applied lipstick in the mirror of Chez Laurent, the upscale French restaurant downtown. At 67, I thought my days of first date jitters were long behind me. Yet here I was, smoothing down my navy dress for the third time, wondering if I'd lost my mind agreeing to meet a complete stranger from an online dating site. "You're being ridiculous, Eleanor," my daughter Sarah had said when I told her about the date. "Men online lie about everything, their age, their photos, their bank accounts, and you said he's from Lebanon. Mom, please be careful." But something about Khalil's messages had drawn me in. His English was impeccable, tinged with formal courtesy that reminded me of my late father's generation. He wrote about art, literature, and loss with a depth that made my chest ache with recognition. After 3 years of widowhood, I craved intelligent conversation more than I craved romance, though I'd be lying if I said the possibility of both didn't terrify and thrill me. I checked my watch, 7:28 p.m. He'd suggested we meet at 8, giving me just enough time to question every decision that led to this moment. The restaurant buzzed with couples leaning over candlelit tables, their conversations mixing into a warm hum that made my solitude feel more pronounced. I touched the empty space on my wrist where my charm bracelet used to rest, a nervous habit I'd never quite shaken, even after losing it decades ago. The maitre d' approached with practiced discretion. "Mrs. Morrison, your table for two is ready. Would you like to be seated, or would you prefer to wait for your guest?" "I'll wait," I said, though my voice came out smaller than intended. "Actually, no. Yes, I'll sit. He should be here soon." As I followed him through the maze of white-clothed tables, I caught my reflection in a mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had I become this person? Silver-haired and careful, selecting restaurants based on their lighting rather than their food. Richard and I used to be adventurous, trying hole-in-the-wall diners and ethnic food trucks. But Richard was gone, and I was here, about to have dinner with a man whose last name I couldn't even pronounce correctly. The table overlooked the restaurant's garden, where tiny lights twinkled like earthbound stars. I ordered a glass of Chardonnay to calm my nerves, and immediately regretted it when the waiter asked if I wanted to wait for my companion before ordering food. The question made everything feel so formal, so intentional. This wasn't just dinner. This was a date, complete with expectations and possibilities I wasn't sure I was ready to navigate. I pulled out my phone to reread Khalil's messages, seeking reassurance in his words. "I find myself thinking about the conversations we might have over dinner, Eleanor. There's something in your writing that speaks of someone who has lived fully, loved deeply, and isn't afraid to begin again. I hope I'm not presumptuous in saying so." He wasn't presumptuous. He was perceptive. That's what scared me. At exactly 8 o'clock, I saw him through the window, pausing to speak with the valet. My breath caught. His online photos had been recent and honest, silver hair swept back, warm brown eyes, and the kind of easy elegance that comes from confidence rather than youth. But seeing him in person, I was struck by how he carried himself, upright and purposeful despite what looked to be a slight limp as he walked. I stood as he approached the table, and he smiled with genuine warmth. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I'm scared too. I'm scared that I've built this meeting up in my mind for so many years that reality can't possibly match it. I'm scared that my children will think I've lost my judgment and that your children will think I'm taking advantage of your loneliness." He squeezed my hands gently. "But mostly, I'm scared of wasting whatever time we might have together by being too careful, too afraid of making mistakes." I looked into his eyes, seeing the same vulnerability I felt reflected back at me. Here we were, two people who'd lived full lives, raised families, buried spouses, and somehow found ourselves standing in a museum feeling like teenagers with our first crush. So what do we do? I asked. We take it one day at a time. We be honest with each other about what we're feeling and what we need, and we try not to let fear make our decisions for us. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and saw Sarah's name. "How was the date, Mom? Call me when you get home." "Your daughter?" Khalil asked, noticing my expression. "Checking up on me. She's been worried about this whole online dating experiment." "What will you tell her?" I considered this, looking around the museum gallery where we stood, surrounded by art that spoke of transformation and possibility. The truth, eventually, but maybe not all at once. We finished our tour of the museum and found ourselves in the cafe, sharing a late lunch and continuing the conversation that had started on a metro platform 44 years ago. Khalil told me about his business, about the challenges of being an Arab American in post-9/11 America, about the pride he felt watching his children succeed in their adopted country. I told him about my teaching years, about the satisfaction of watching teenagers discover their own voices through writing, about the difficulty of retirement, and the strange freedom of having time that belonged entirely to me. "Do you miss teaching?" he asked. Every day. I loved the energy of it, the sense that I was helping young people figure out who they wanted to become. I stirred my coffee thoughtfully. But I also love having time to read for pleasure again, to travel when I want, to make decisions based on what sounds interesting rather than what's responsible. That sounds like good preparation for whatever comes next. Is that what this is? He smiled. I hope so. I hope this is the beginning of something, not just a lovely afternoon with good memories attached. As we left the museum, the afternoon sun was slanting through the trees, creating the kind of golden light that makes ordinary moments feel cinematic. Khalil's driver was waiting in the parking lot, and I felt a familiar tug of disappointment that the day was ending. "Would you like to have dinner?" Khalil asked as we approached the car. "Nothing fancy. I noticed a charming Italian place on the way here." I thought about my empty house, the frozen dinner I'd probably heat up, the evening of television that would fill the hours until bedtime. Then I looked at Khalil, at the hopeful expression he was trying to hide behind casual politeness. "I'd love to," I said. The Italian restaurant was exactly the kind of place Richard and I used to love, family-owned, loud with conversation, smelling of garlic and herbs. We were seated at a small table near the window, and I watched Khalil examine the menu with the same careful attention he'd given the museum placards. "I have another confession," he said as we waited for our food. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier about falling for me faster than feels safe." My cheeks warmed. That was probably too honest. No, it was exactly honest enough, because I've been feeling the same way, and I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to say so. "What's appropriate at our age?" I asked. "I feel like I'm making up the rules as I go along." Maybe that's the advantage of being older. We get to write our own rules instead of following someone else's timeline. The food arrived, and we fell into the easy rhythm of shared meals and continued conversation. Khalil had stories about his art, his travels, his children's accomplishments and challenges. I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone. My fears about aging alone, my frustration with well-meaning friends who thought I should be grateful for any male attention, my secret pride in having figured out how to manage finances and home repairs on my own. "You're remarkable, Eleanor," he said, as we shared a dessert of tiramisu that was almost too rich to finish. "I don't think you realize how remarkable you are." "I'm really not. I'm just a retired teacher who's trying to figure out what the rest of her life looks like." "You're a woman who raised children, built a career, cared for an aging husband, and then rebuilt her life after loss. You're a woman who took a chance on meeting a stranger from the internet and who's brave enough to admit when something scares her." He reached across the table and touched my bracelet, making the charms chime softly together. "And you're the girl who was curious enough about the world to study in Paris and kind enough to talk to a lonely foreign student on a train." I felt tears prick at my eyes, though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was the way he saw me, not as someone diminished by age and widowhood, but as someone whose experiences had added depth and strength. Maybe it was the surreal perfection of sitting across from someone who'd been a treasured memory for decades, finding that reality was better than remembrance. "Khalil," I said, "what happens when you go back to Chicago? Your life is there, your business, your routine?" "I've been thinking about that. I can work from anywhere now. Most of my business is conducted over the phone and email anyway. And I've been considering a change of scenery." "You'd move here?" "I'd consider it if I had a reason to." The weight of what he was suggesting settled over me. This wasn't just about dinner dates and museum visits. He was talking about reorganizing his life around the possibility of us. "That's a big decision to make based on 2 days," I said carefully. "It is, but I'm not 23 anymore, Eleanor. I don't have unlimited time to take things slow and see what develops naturally. If I'm going to make a change, I need to make it while I'm still healthy enough to enjoy it." We drove back to my house in comfortable silence, both lost in thoughts too large and complex for easy conversation. The day had been perfect in a way that felt almost engineered. Beautiful weather, engaging conversation, the easy companionship of two people discovering they liked each other's company. But underneath the perfection was the question that neither of us had asked directly. What did we really want from each other? Was this a sweet reunion that would fade back into fond memory, or the beginning of something that would require us to reorganize our carefully constructed solitary lives? At my front door, Khalil walked me to the threshold again, and this time the good night felt weighted with possibility and decision. "Tomorrow is my last day in the city," he said. "I fly back to Chicago Sunday morning." "I know. Would you like to spend it with me? We could drive up the coast, or find a farmer's market, or just sit in your garden and talk." I looked at my house with its neat landscaping and predictable routines, then at Khalil, who represented all the uncertainty and possibility I'd been avoiding for 3 years. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that very much." This time, when he kissed my cheek, I turned slightly so that our lips brushed, just for a moment, just enough to confirm that the attraction was mutual and real. "Sleep well, Eleanor," he said. "You too, Khalil." I watched him walk to the car, noting that his limp seemed less pronounced than it had the day before. Maybe he was getting used to being active again, or maybe contentment was better medicine than I'd realized. Inside, I called Sarah before I could lose my nerve. "Mom, how was the date? Tell me everything." I settled into Richard's chair again, touching my bracelet as I chose my words carefully. "It was surprising," I said. "Better than I expected." "Surprising how? He wasn't a serial killer or secretly married, was he?" "No, nothing like that. He was exactly who he said he was, maybe more so." I told her about the dinner, about Khalil's kindness and intelligence, about feeling comfortable with someone new for the first time in years. I didn't tell her about Paris or the bracelet or the impossible coincidence that had brought us together. That story was too fragile, too unbelievable, too precious to share until I understood what it meant. "So will you see him again?" Sarah asked. "Tomorrow. Then he goes back to Chicago." "Oh, Mom, be careful, okay? I know you're lonely, and he sounds lovely, but long-distance relationships are complicated even when you're young." "I know, sweetheart. I'm being careful." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house, listening to the familiar sounds of evening. The neighbor's dog barking, the teenagers next door playing music too loud, the ancient heating system settling for the night. These sounds had been the soundtrack of my solitude for 3 years, and I'd grown comfortable with them. But tonight, they felt different. Tonight, they felt like the background music of a life that was about to change, whether I was ready for it or not. Saturday morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes staying inside feel virtuous rather than lazy. I woke up thinking about Khalil's suggestion that we spend his last day together, wondering if rain would change his plans. My phone buzzed at 8:30. "Good morning. I know the weather doesn't look promising, but I have an idea if you're up for an adventure. Would you be interested in cooking together? I could bring groceries and we could make lunch at your house." The suggestion was so domestic, so unexpectedly intimate, that I stared at the message for a full minute before responding. Inviting him into my kitchen felt like a bigger step than dinner at restaurants or museum visits. My kitchen was where I'd cooked thousands of meals for Richard and the children, where I'd stood crying the day after the funeral, where I'd slowly learned to cook for one instead of four. But it was also where I'd found peace in the quiet rituals of bread making and soup simmering, where I'd rediscovered the pleasure of cooking for its own sake rather than out of obligation. "That sounds wonderful," I texted back. "What did you have in mind?" "Something that requires conversation while we work." "Pasta from scratch? Risotto? I'm a competent cook, so you won't have to worry about me burning down your kitchen." "Risotto sounds perfect. Should I provide anything besides the kitchen?" "Just yourself and patience. I'll bring everything else." He arrived at noon with bags of groceries and a bottle of wine, dressed in jeans and a casual shirt that made him look younger and more relaxed than he had in restaurants. I'd chosen my own clothes carefully, comfortable but not sloppy, attractive but not overdressed for cooking. "Your house is beautiful," he said, as I led him through the living room to the kitchen. "It feels like a home where people have been happy." "We were," I said simply, "most of the time." My kitchen was large and well-equipped, with windows that looked out over the garden Richard and I had planted together. Even on this gray morning, the flowers and herbs provided splashes of color that made the room feel warm and welcoming. Khalil unpacked his groceries with the efficiency of someone comfortable in kitchens, laying out ingredients like an artist arranging a palette. Arborio rice, good Parmesan, fresh herbs, mushrooms, onions, wine, and stock he'd made himself and transported in a thermos. "You made your own stock?" I asked, impressed despite myself. "I had time this morning, and hotel coffee wasn't going to sustain me through a day of cooking." He handed me a glass of wine. "I hope you don't mind that I took some liberties with your menu." I'm delighted by someone who takes cooking seriously. We fell into the rhythm of cooking together with surprising ease. Khalil chopped vegetables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years preparing family meals, while I gathered pots and utensils and set up our workspace. The conversation flowed as naturally as it had over restaurant tables, but there was something more intimate about talking while our hands were busy with shared tasks. "Tell me about your marriage," I said, as I watched him sauté mushrooms with careful attention to their color and texture. "What made it work for 43 years?" He considered this, adding wine to the pan with a satisfying sizzle. "We liked each other," he said simply. "Even when we didn't particularly like each other's behavior, we still enjoyed each other's company. And we both understood that marriage is a long-term project, not a series of short-term emotions." "That's wise. Richard and I used to say that marriage was like tending a garden. Some seasons are better than others, but you keep showing up and doing the work." Exactly. He began adding stock to the rice, one ladle at a time, stirring constantly. "What about you? What do you miss most about being married?" I thought about this as I cleaned up the cutting boards and prep bowls. The daily companionship. Having someone to share the small moments with, the funny thing you heard on the radio, the neighbor's ridiculous new fence, the way the light looks at sunset. Those tiny connections that don't seem important until they're gone. And what don't you miss? The question surprised me with its directness, but I found I had an immediate answer, having to negotiate every decision. As much as I loved Richard, it's been liberating to choose what to have for dinner without consulting anyone, or to plan a weekend without checking someone else's preferences. So you've discovered the advantages of solitude. Some of them, but I've also discovered its limitations. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, the risotto requiring constant attention and stirring. I found myself watching Khalil's hands as he worked, capable and sure, with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of practice. There was something deeply attractive about competence, about watching someone do something well without fuss or show. "Eleanor," he said, as he added another ladle of stock, "can I ask you something that might be too personal?" "After yesterday, I think we're past worrying about too personal. Are you happy? I mean, in your life as it is now, are you content?" I considered this, testing the rice for doneness and adding more Parmesan. "I'm peaceful. I've built a life that's comfortable and predictable, and after the chaos of Richard's illness and death, peace felt like enough. But is peace the same as happiness? I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." "What about you? Are you happy?" He turned off the heat under the risotto and looked directly at me. I was resigned. I thought I'd had my share of love and adventure, and that the rest of my life would be about managing my health and enjoying my grandchildren. He paused. "But this weekend has reminded me that resignation and contentment aren't the same thing either." We served the risotto with a simple salad and the bottle of wine Khalil had brought. The food was perfect, creamy and rich without being heavy, the flavors clean and well-balanced. But more than that, it was food we'd created together, a small act of collaboration that felt significant in a way that surprised me. "This is delicious," I said. "You're a better cook than I expected." Amira taught me. She said that anyone who expected to eat well should know how to create good food, not just consume it. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. She would have liked you, I think. She had strong opinions about people who were authentic versus those who were performing some version of themselves. I wasn't sure how to respond to that, so I changed the subject. "What's your plan for when you go back to Chicago? Back to normal routines?" "I'm not sure normal exists anymore," he said. "This weekend has shifted something for me, Eleanor. I can't pretend it hasn't." "What do you mean?" He set down his fork and looked at me seriously. "I mean that I don't want to go back to my old life and pretend this was just a nice diversion. I want to figure out how to build something real with you, even if it's complicated and scary and impractical for people our age." My heart began to pound, though whether from excitement or panic, I couldn't tell. "Khalil, we've known each other for 2 days. Well, 2 days and 1 evening 44 years ago. I know, and if I were 30, I'd take things slow and see how it developed. But I'm not 30, Eleanor. I'm 69 years old, and I don't have time to waste on being careful about something that feels this right." I got up and walked to the window, looking out at my rain-soaked garden. The flowers looked bedraggled but resilient, the kind of beauty that comes from surviving difficult weather. "What are you suggesting?" I asked without turning around. "I'm suggesting that I extend my trip for a few more days while we figure out if this feeling is sustainable. I'm suggesting that you come visit me in Chicago next month so you can see my life there. And I'm suggesting that we stop pretending this is just a pleasant coincidence and start treating it like what it might be, a second chance." I turned to face him, seeing the same vulnerability in his expression that I felt in my chest. A second chance at what? Love, companionship, building a life with someone who understands that time is precious and shouldn't be wasted on games or pretense. The word love hung in the air between us, both wonderful and terrifying. I thought about Sarah's warnings, about the comfortable routines I built, about the risk of disrupting a life that worked, even if it wasn't particularly exciting. But I also thought about the way Khalil listened when I talked, the way he'd kept my bracelet safe for 44 years, the way cooking together had felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm scared," I said honestly. "I know, so am I." "What if it doesn't work? What if we're two lonely people who are mistaking nostalgia and physical attraction for something deeper? Then we'll find out, and we'll deal with whatever we discover. But Eleanor, what if it does work? What if we're two people who found each other twice, and this time we're smart enough to not let circumstances pull us apart? I walked back to the table and sat down across from him, studying his face, the lines that spoke of decades of laughter and sorrow, the eyes that had seen me truly from the beginning, the hands that had created art and built a business and kept my memory safe when I didn't even know it needed protecting. "If you extend your trip," I said slowly, "where would you stay?" "I could find an extended stay hotel or rent a small apartment for a month." "That seems expensive and impractical." "Eleanor, are you—" "I have a guest room," I said quickly before I could change my mind. "It has its own bathroom, and the door locks if you're worried about propriety. You could stay here while we figure this out." The suggestion surprised us both. I'd never invited a man to stay in my house, not since Richard died, not even my own son when he visited. But the idea of Khalil leaving tomorrow felt suddenly unbearable, and the idea of him staying in some anonymous hotel room felt like we were admitting that this was temporary, unimportant. "Are you sure?" he asked. "That's a big step." "Everything about this has been a big step. Besides, we're too old to worry about what the neighbors think." He smiled, the same warm expression that had made me trust him on a metro train when I was young and scared. "I would love to stay here if you're really comfortable with the arrangement." "I am. Surprisingly, I am." We spent the afternoon in the living room, looking through photo albums and sharing stories from the decades we'd lived apart. Khalil had pictures of his children at various stages, of Amira laughing at family gatherings, of art shows and business trips, and the ordinary moments that make up a life. I showed him pictures of Richard and me, of Sarah and Michael growing up, of holidays and vacations, and the 1,000 small celebrations that had marked our years together. It felt strange but right to share these memories with someone new, to see my life through his eyes. "You were beautiful as a young mother," he said, studying a picture of me holding baby Sarah. "But you're more beautiful now." "That's kind, but I know what mirrors show me. Mirrors show you lines and gray hair. I see someone who's lived fully and isn't afraid to keep living." As evening approached, we called the airline to extend Khalil's stay. He would fly back to Chicago the following weekend, which gave us 7 more days to explore whatever this was becoming. "I should probably call my children," he said as we hung up with the airline. "They'll worry if I don't check in as planned." "What will you tell them?" "The truth, that I've met someone remarkable and want to spend more time getting to know her." I listened from the kitchen as he made his calls, speaking to his son in English and his daughter in what I assumed was Arabic. His voice was warm and patient as he answered their questions, and I heard him laugh several times at what were obviously their concerns about his judgment. When he finished, he came to find me in the kitchen where I was making tea. "Well?" I asked. "Omar thinks I've lost my mind and is threatening to fly out here to meet you. Lila is more cautiously optimistic, but wants to FaceTime with you before she gives her approval." "And how do you feel about their reactions?" "Grateful that I raised children who care enough to worry about me making foolish decisions." "Are we making foolish decisions?" He considered this, accepting the cup of tea I offered him. "Probably." "But the alternative? Walking away from something that feels this right because it's inconvenient or complicated seems more foolish." That night, I showed Khalil the guest room, apologizing for the feminine decor and slightly musty smell of a room that was rarely used. "It's perfect," he said, setting his suitcase on the bench at the foot of the bed. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me stay here." We stood in the doorway, both suddenly aware of the intimacy of the situation. This was a man I'd known for essentially 3 days, and I'd just invited him to stay in my home for a week? By any rational measure, it was impulsive and potentially dangerous. But nothing about this situation had been rational from the beginning. "Good night, Khalil," I said. "Good night, Eleanor." I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving around my house. Water running in the guest bathroom, footsteps on the hardwood floors, the soft click of a door closing. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't alone in my house at night. The thought should have made me nervous, but instead it made me feel something I'd almost forgotten, the particular contentment that comes from sharing space with someone you care about. I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and something baking, scents that hadn't filled my kitchen since the last time Sarah had visited with her family. For a moment, I lay in bed disoriented, wondering if I'd dreamed the entire weekend. Then I heard Khalil moving around downstairs, and reality settled over me like a warm blanket. He was here, in my house, making breakfast. I found him in the kitchen, dressed in the same jeans and casual shirt from the day before, standing at the stove with a dish towel tucked into his waistband like an apron. The coffee was fresh, and something that smelled like cinnamon bread was cooling on a rack by the window. "Good morning," I said, suddenly self-conscious about my hair and my bathrobe. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind that I helped myself to your kitchen. I'm an early riser, and I thought you might enjoy waking up to breakfast for a change." I can't remember the last time someone made me breakfast. I poured myself coffee and noticed that he'd set the table for two, with cloth napkins and the good plates I rarely used. This is lovely. It's just scrambled eggs and quick bread, nothing fancy. But it wasn't just breakfast. It was care made visible, the kind of small kindness that transforms ordinary mornings into something special. I watched him work, noting how naturally he moved around my kitchen, how he'd somehow intuited where things belonged. "Did you sleep well?" I asked. "Better than I have in months. Your house is peaceful." We ate breakfast together as morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, talking about the day ahead. The weather had cleared, revealing the kind of crystalline autumn day that makes you grateful to be alive. "I have an idea," Khalil said as we finished eating. "Would you like to drive up to the mountains? I noticed on the map that there are several small towns within an hour's drive. We could explore, maybe find an antique shop or a farmer's market." "That sounds perfect. I haven't done anything spontaneous in years." "Then it's time to start." We spent the day wandering through small mountain towns, browsing antique shops and galleries, eating lunch at a cafe that overlooked a valley painted in autumn colors. Khalil proved to be an easy travel companion, curious about local history, willing to explore unexpected detours, comfortable with the kind of aimless wandering that can fill a day with small discoveries. In one antique shop, I found a set of vintage teacups that reminded me of ones my grandmother had owned. Khalil bought them for me despite my protests, saying they belonged in a house where people appreciated beautiful things. "You don't need to buy me gifts," I said as we carried them to the car. I want to give you things that will remind you of today when I'm back in Chicago." The comment brought reality crashing back. In 6 days, he would get on a plane and return to his life, and I would be left with teacups and memories of a perfect week that might have been an elaborate fantasy. "Khalil," I said as we drove home through the golden late afternoon light, "what happens after next weekend? I mean, really happens, not what we hope might happen." He was quiet for a long moment, navigating a winding mountain road that required attention. "I think we talk on the phone every day. I think you come visit me in Chicago next month, and I come back here for Thanksgiving. I think we figure out whether this feeling survives real life, bills and bad moods and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. And if it does survive, then we figure out what comes next. Maybe I sell my house and move here. Maybe you consider relocating to Chicago. Maybe we find some third option that neither of us has thought of yet. Those are big changes for people our age." Eleanor, people our age don't have time for small changes. If we're going to reorganize our lives, we need to do it while we're still healthy enough to enjoy the results. That evening, we cooked dinner together again, this time something simple that allowed us to focus on conversation rather than technique. I was struck by how easily we'd fallen into domestic routines, how natural it felt to plan meals and share kitchen tasks with someone new. After dinner, Khalil suggested we sit in the garden, where the last of the season's flowers were putting on a final show before frost. I brought out sweaters and wine, and we settled into the wicker chairs Richard and I had bought years ago but rarely used. "Tell me about your fears," Khalil said as we watched the sunset behind the neighbor's trees. "About what specifically?" "About this, about me, about changing your life for someone you've known for a week." I considered how to be honest without being hurtful. "I'm afraid that I'm not as interesting as you think I am. I'm afraid that my life is too small, too quiet, too predictable for someone who's traveled the world and built businesses and created art. And I'm afraid that I've forgotten how to be part of a couple, that I've become too set in my ways, too selfish with my time and space." I sipped my wine, gathering courage for the deepest fear. "And I'm afraid that this feeling, this connection, is based on nostalgia and loneliness rather than genuine compatibility." Khalil nodded thoughtfully. "Those are reasonable fears. Do you want to know mine?" "Yes." "I'm afraid that I'm rushing you into something you're not ready for because I don't want to waste time being cautious. I'm afraid that my children will think I'm having some kind of late-life crisis and trying to replace their mother." He paused, looking out at the darkening garden. "And I'm afraid that if I let myself fall completely in love with you, and then we discover this doesn't work, I'll be too old to recover from that kind of disappointment." The word love, again, used so naturally that it took my breath away. "Are you falling in love with me?" I asked quietly. "I think I started falling in love with you 44 years ago on a metro train. This weekend just reminded me what that felt like." I reached across the space between our chairs and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine. "I think I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me." "Good," he said, squeezing my fingers gently. "It should terrify us. Love at our age isn't the same as love at 25. We know too much about how things can go wrong, how quickly life can change, how precious and fragile happiness really is." We sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the garden. I could hear the ordinary sounds of suburban evening, cars passing on the street, neighbors calling children inside, the distant hum of televisions and dishwashers. But sitting there with Khalil's hand in mine, everything felt transformed, as if I were seeing my familiar world through new eyes. "I want to try," I said finally. "I want to see if this is real, if it can survive the ordinary challenges of two people building a life together. Even if it means taking risks, even if it means disappointing your children or confusing your friends. Even then." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my palm gently. "Then we'll figure it out together." That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was startled by what I saw. There was color in my cheeks, light in my eyes, and energy in my posture that I hadn't seen in years. I looked like a woman with something to anticipate, someone with reasons to look forward rather than backward. In the guest room down the hall, Khalil was probably going through his own nighttime routines, brushing his teeth with the toothbrush he'd bought at the drugstore, reading glasses perched on his nose as he checked emails or read before sleep. The domesticity of it should have felt strange, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Tomorrow, we would wake up together again, share coffee and conversation, continue the delicate process of learning each other's rhythms and preferences. We would have 6 more days to test whether this connection could survive the scrutiny of extended time together. I touched my bracelet before turning off the light, feeling each familiar charm in the darkness. 44 years ago, losing it had felt like losing a piece of myself. Tonight, having it back felt like reclaiming possibilities I thought were gone forever. Some things, I thought as I drifted off to sleep, are worth waiting for, even when you don't know you're waiting. The rest of the week passed in a haze of contentment I hadn't experienced since the early days of my marriage to Richard. Khalil and I fell into rhythms that felt both new and familiar. Morning coffee on the back porch, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evenings spent cooking together and talking until late. He proved to be an ideal house guest, helpful without being intrusive, independent enough to give me space when I needed it, and endlessly interesting in conversation. He read voraciously and had opinions about everything from local politics to international affairs to the proper way to prune roses. More importantly, he listened to my opinions with the same attention and respect. On Tuesday, he insisted on meeting Sarah for lunch over my worried protests that it was too early for family introductions. "Eleanor," he said as I fretted about what to wear and how to explain our situation, "am not going anywhere without your daughter's approval. If she thinks I'm wrong for you, then I need to know that now. And if she does think you're wrong for me, then I'll have to convince her otherwise or accept that I've misjudged the situation." The lunch was at a small bistro downtown, neutral territory that wouldn't commit anyone to extended socializing if things went badly. I sat between them, feeling like a teenager introducing her boyfriend to her parents, watching their faces for signs of approval or disapproval. Sarah, to her credit, was polite but direct, asking Khalil about his background, his intentions, his plans for the future. He answered with the same straightforward honesty he'd shown me, neither defensive nor overly eager to impress. "So you really kept my mother's bracelet for over 40 years?" Sarah asked, her skepticism evident. "I did. It seemed too precious to throw away, and I kept hoping I'd find a way to return it." "That's either very romantic or very obsessive." Khalil laughed. "A little of both, probably, but mostly it was just hope that someday I'd see her again." After lunch, Sarah walked me to my car while Khalil waited discreetly at a distance. "Mom," she said, "I don't know what to think. He seems wonderful, but this whole situation is unlikely, intense. You've known him for a week, and you're talking about him moving here or you moving to Chicago. That's not like you. Maybe it's exactly like me, and I've just forgotten who I am when I'm not being careful and responsible all the time." Sarah studied my face with the same careful attention she'd given her college textbooks. "You look happy," she said finally, "happier than you've looked since Dad died." "I am happy. Confused and scared, but happy," Khalil said, taking my offered hand in both of his. "You're even more beautiful than your photograph suggested." "You're very kind, Khalil." His accent was subtle, adding a musical quality to his words that made my name sound like something precious. "Please, sit." As he settled across from me, I noticed everything my nervous excitement had missed in our video calls. The laugh lines around his eyes, the gold watch that looked substantial and well-worn, the way he moved with careful deliberation, as if each gesture was considered. He was handsome in the way that comes with age, character written in every line, stories held in the set of his shoulders. "I hope you didn't wait long," he said, signaling the waiter. "Traffic from the hotel was worse than I expected." "Not at all. I was early. Occupational hazard of anxiety." The admission slipped out before I could stop it, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. He laughed, a rich sound that made something tight in my chest loosen. "I spent an hour in my hotel room changing clothes. At my age, you'd think I'd have learned to trust my first instincts about what to wear." "What did you settle on?" I asked, though I could see he'd chosen perfectly: a dark suit that spoke of quality without flash, a crisp white shirt open at the collar. My late wife used to say that when in doubt, dress as if you're meeting someone important. His expression grew soft. Tonight felt important. The waiter appeared, and Khalil ordered wine with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to fine restaurants. As we waited, he asked about my work, my children, my life in the city. His questions weren't intrusive, but they invited confession. I found myself telling him about my years as a high school English teacher, about Sarah and Michael and their families, about the loneliness that had finally driven me to try online dating after my friends' increasingly desperate attempts at matchmaking. "Your friends sound well-intentioned," he said, raising his wine glass, "but sometimes we need to find our own way to what we're seeking." "And what are you seeking, Khalil?" The question surprised me with its directness. He considered this, rotating his glass slowly between his fingers. Companionship, conversation, someone who understands that life doesn't end at 65, it just changes shape. He met my eyes. "What about you?" I thought of Sarah's warnings, of my own fears about vulnerability at this stage of life. "I'm not sure. I know I'm tired of eating dinner alone, tired of having no one to share the small moments with. My husband and I used to debate everything: movies, politics, whether the neighbor's dog was actually plotting against our garden. I miss having someone to argue with." "Did you win the arguments?" "Always," I said with mock seriousness, then laughed. "Actually, never. Richard was annoyingly logical, but I was more creative in my reasoning." A formidable combination, logic and creativity. He was lucky to have both in his life. Something in his tone made me study his face more carefully. "You mentioned your wife earlier. How long has it been?" 5 years in December. He said it simply, without the careful distance I still wrapped around Richard's death. Amira was extraordinary. We had 43 years together. "That's beautiful. Were you happy?" The question hung between us, more intimate than I'd intended, but Khalil didn't seem uncomfortable with it. "Most days," he said. "We had our share of difficulties. My work required a lot of travel. Her family never quite approved of her marrying someone they saw as too westernized. But yes, we were happy. We understood each other." I nodded, recognizing the shorthand of long marriages. Richard and I had developed our own language over 38 years, glances across crowded rooms, inside jokes that made no sense to outsiders, the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other's rhythms. The food arrived, and we fell into the easy intimacy of sharing a meal. Khalil had impeccable table manners without being precious about them, and he ate with obvious pleasure. I found myself relaxing, enjoying the simple act of conversation with someone who listened carefully and responded thoughtfully. "Tell me about Lebanon," I said over dessert. "Do you miss it?" "Every day," he said without hesitation. "But I've been in the States for over 30 years now. My children were raised here. My grandchildren are American. Home becomes complicated when you've lived in multiple places." "Where do your children live?" "Omar is in Seattle. He's a doctor, pediatric surgery. Lila is in Philadelphia. She teaches at the university, art history." His pride was evident. "They worry about me, especially since Amira died. They think I should move closer to one of them, but I'm not ready to be anyone's burden." I recognized the fear in his words, the same one that kept me in my too large house, despite Sarah's gentle suggestions about condos and retirement communities. Independence is precious when you've had it for so long. "Exactly." He leaned forward slightly. "But independence shouldn't mean isolation, should it?" Before I could answer, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I brought something for you," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. I hope this isn't presumptuous, but when I saw it in the hotel gift shop, it reminded me of something you wrote in one of your messages about losing jewelry that had sentimental value. My heart began to pound as he slid the box across the table. Inside was a delicate silver chain bracelet with small charms, a book, a flower, a heart. It was lovely, thoughtful, and completely wrong, but as I lifted it from the box, something caught the light underneath. There, nestled in the velvet, was another bracelet. This one was tarnished silver with charms I recognized like old friends. A tiny Eiffel Tower, a graduation cap, a baby shoe, a wedding ring, a small elephant with its trunk raised for luck. My fingers froze on the familiar weight of it. "Where did you get this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise. Khalil's expression changed, concern replacing the gentle nervousness he'd shown when presenting the gift. "Eleanor, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I held up the tarnished bracelet, my hand shaking so violently that the charms jingled together in a sound I hadn't heard for over 40 years. "This is my bracelet, my actual bracelet. I lost it in 1962 when I was in Paris with my college roommate. We were robbed on the metro, and they took my purse with everything in it." The restaurant seemed to fade around us as Khalil stared at me, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something else I couldn't quite identify. He reached across the table and gently took the bracelet from my trembling fingers, examining it closely. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "what was your maiden name?" "Patterson. Why?" But even as I asked, pieces were clicking into place in my mind, pieces I didn't want to fit together. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, then looked directly at me. "You were studying at the Sorbonne that summer. You had long auburn hair that you wore in a braid down your back. You were crying on the platform at Châtelet Station because someone had stolen your bag and you didn't have money for a taxi back to your apartment." The blood drained from my face. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling dizzy. "That's impossible." "You can't know that unless—" The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. A young man with kind eyes had seen me crying and offered to help. He'd bought me a metro ticket and ridden with me to make sure I got home safely. We talked the entire journey about art, about literature, about the strange magic of Paris in summer. His name had been Khalil, I breathed. He nodded, his own hands shaking now. "I was 23. I was studying at the École des Beaux-Arts on a scholarship, and you were the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen, even crying and angry about your stolen purse." I stared at him, trying to reconcile the young man from my memory with the distinguished gentleman sitting across from me. 44 years collapsed into nothing, and suddenly I was 21 again, feeling grateful and charmed by the foreign student who'd rescued me from my panic on the subway platform. "But you said your name was Carl," I said, confusion warring with recognition. It was easier then. People struggled with Khalil, and I was tired of correcting pronunciation. I told most people to call me Carl. He smiled sadly. "I regretted it later, especially with you. I felt like I'd lied about who I was." The pieces kept falling into place. "You asked me to have coffee with you." "The next day, but you never came." "I couldn't find the cafe. You'd written the address on a piece of paper, but—" I gestured helplessly. "I looked for you." I went back to that metro station several times, hoping I might see you again. We sat in stunned silence, the impossible coincidence settling over us like a heavy blanket. The other diners continued their conversations, wine glasses clinked, the waiter refilled bread baskets, but our little table had become an island outside of time. "How do you have my bracelet?" I finally asked. Carl, whoever he was, seemed to struggle with how to explain. The boy who robbed you? He was from my neighborhood, a troubled kid named Hassan, whose family had been kind to me when I first arrived in Paris. A few days after I met you, Hassan came to me, panicked. He'd been arrested for pickpocketing, and the police had found several stolen items in his apartment. He knew I'd been trying to learn French law to help other Arab students, so he begged me to help him. He paused, rotating his wine glass again, but this time the gesture seemed more like a prayer than nervousness. When I saw the police inventory, your bracelet was listed. I recognized the description. You told me about each charm during our train ride. The Eiffel Tower from your first day in Paris, the graduation cap from high school, the baby shoe from when your nephew was born. He met my eyes. I convinced Hassan to make restitution to his victims instead of going to trial. But by then, the semester was ending. I tried to find you, Eleanor, but you'd left Paris. I came home early, I whispered. After the robbery, my parents wanted me back. They were worried about me being alone in a foreign country. I kept the bracelet, thinking I'd find a way to return it someday. It seemed too precious to leave in police evidence. He reached across the table and touched my hand gently. I carried it with me when I immigrated to America. It's been in my jewelry box for over 4 decades. I stared down at our joined hands, his broader and more weathered than they'd been when I was 21, mine showing the age spots and thin skin that come with decades of living. But the connection between us felt exactly the same as it had on that metro train in 1962. This is insane, I said, though I was smiling through tears I didn't remember starting to cry. What are the odds? I've been asking myself the same question for 3 weeks, he admitted. 3 weeks? That's when I realized who you were. Your profile mentioned that you'd studied in Paris, and something about your writing style reminded me of our conversation on the train. But it wasn't until you mentioned the lost bracelet in one of your messages that I was certain. I felt a chill run down my spine. So you knew when you asked me out? You knew who I was? He nodded, looking suddenly vulnerable. I should have told you immediately, but I was afraid you'd think I was some kind of stalker, or that you wouldn't believe me. And honestly, Eleanor, I was afraid you wouldn't remember me at all. Not remember you? I laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and joy. Carl, you were my Paris romance. I told that story for years about the handsome foreign student who rescued me on the metro and then disappeared like something out of a movie. My college friends were convinced I'd made you up. I was hardly handsome, he protested, but he was smiling now. You were to me. You had the most beautiful eyes, and you spoke English with this careful precision that made everything sound important. And you listened to me, really listened. Most American boys my age just waited for their turn to talk. We looked at each other across the table, and I saw both the young man I'd remembered and the older man I was getting to know. It was disconcerting and wonderful and absolutely terrifying. So what now? I asked. This is either the most romantic coincidence in history or the most elaborate catfish scheme ever attempted. He laughed, the same rich sound that had made me feel safe on a crowded train 4 decades ago. I have my passport in my hotel room and probably some old sketches from art school that would prove my identity. Though I admit the catfish scheme would be impressively long-term. I picked up my bracelet, fastening it around my wrist with fingers that only shook a little. The familiar weight of it felt like coming home. I can't believe you kept it all these years. I couldn't throw it away. It was my only connection to what felt like the most real conversation I'd had since leaving Lebanon. The waiter appeared to refill our wine, and I realized we'd been sitting in the restaurant for over 2 hours. The dinner crowd had thinned, leaving mostly couples lingering over dessert and conversation. We looked like any other older couple enjoying an evening out, but I felt like I was living in a fairy tale written by someone with a particularly twisted sense of humor. Your children, I said suddenly, do they know about tonight? I told them I was having dinner with someone I'd met online. Lila made me promise to text her when I got back to the hotel. He smiled ruefully. They worry I'm too trusting for internet dating. My daughter said the exact same thing. She warned me specifically about men who claim to be wealthy and sophisticated. I am wealthy and sophisticated, he said with mock offense. I made my fortune in import-export, I have advanced degrees, and I can discuss wine without sounding pretentious. And modest, too, I teased. Devastatingly so. The easy banter felt natural, as if we'd been picking up conversations from yesterday instead of from 1962. But underneath the comfort was a current of something more complex, the weight of decades lived apart, of choices made and unmade, of the strange mathematics of timing and chance. Khalil, I said, testing his real name on my tongue. What happens next? I mean, assuming you're not an elaborate figment of my imagination brought on by too much wine and wishful thinking. He considered this seriously. I don't know. I hadn't planned beyond tonight, beyond returning your bracelet and seeing if you remembered me. He paused. What would you like to happen? It was a fair question, and one I wasn't sure how to answer. At 21, I might have thrown caution to the wind, might have seen this as destiny demanding to be embraced. At 67, I knew that coincidences, no matter how magical, didn't automatically create happy endings. I'd like to not let another 44 years pass before we see each other again, I said carefully. That seems reasonable. I'm staying in the city until Sunday. I have some business meetings tomorrow and Saturday. Would you be interested in spending time together? I'd understand if this is all too overwhelming. I thought about my comfortable routines, my quiet house, my predictable days. Then I looked at the bracelet on my wrist and at the man who'd kept it safe for nearly half a century. Yes, I said, I'd like that very much. We walked out of the restaurant together into the warm evening air. Khalil had called for the car service, and we stood on the sidewalk waiting, neither quite ready to end the evening, but both overwhelmed by everything that had been revealed. Eleanor, he said quietly, I want you to know that I didn't engineer this meeting to manipulate you or to recreate something from the past. I genuinely was looking for companionship, and I chose to contact you because your profile intrigued me. The bracelet, the connection to Paris, it was a gift I hadn't expected. I studied his face in the glow of the restaurant's lights, looking for any sign of deception or calculation. All I saw was the same earnestness that had made me trust him on a metro train when I was young and scared and far from home. I believe you, I said, and I'm glad you kept the bracelet. Whatever this is, coincidence, fate, or just two lonely people finding each other at the right moment, I'm grateful for it. The car pulled up and Khalil opened the door for me. As I settled into the back seat, he climbed in beside me and gave the driver my address. How did you know where I live? I asked, then immediately felt foolish. Never mind, online profiles. Actually, I was going to ask for directions, but you're right. I did notice you live in the Riverside district. It's beautiful there. We rode in comfortable silence for most of the journey, both lost in our own thoughts. As we turned onto my street, I felt the familiar tug of anxiety that comes with the end of a date, the awkwardness of determining what comes next, the delicate dance of interest and boundaries. But this wasn't really a first date, was it? It was a continuation of a conversation that had been interrupted by circumstances and time. Or maybe it was both, first date and reunion, new beginning and completion of something started long ago. The car stopped in front of my house, a Tudor-style home that Richard and I had bought when the children were young. It looked solid and welcoming in the evening light, the garden I tended with increasing devotion since becoming a widow, showing the results of my care.